Welcome, everyone. My name is Isabel Janiches. I'm with the Healthy Soil Working Group here in New Mexico, and I'm really pleased to present this webinar in partnership with the Xerxes Society for Invertebrate Conservation. This will be all about assessing soil health by using our knowledge about soil life and observing soil life. And I'm personally excited because I still have a lot to learn there, and I love to see the little creepy crawlies in our soils. So we're here with Jennifer Hopwood, Senior Pollinator Conservation Entomologist at Xerxes. She will mainly talk about those soil critter profiles, and also Caitlin Hase, our local pollinator conservation specialist for the Southwest, and she's here in Santa Fe. And she'll provide also some local context and organizational work and share some individual actions you all can take. We'll have about an hour of the presentation and then time for questions. So see how long that takes. During the presentation, feel free to put your questions in the chat and we'll address them either as we go or afterwards. And so with that, without further ado, take it away, Caitlin and Jennifer. Thank you so much for being here with us.
Yeah, thank you, Isabel, for having us. And thanks to the New Mexico Healthy Soils Working Group for hosting. As Isabel mentioned, my name's Caitlin Hase, and I'm based in Santa Fe. And thank you all for joining. I'm very excited that this will be a great recorded resource and we can take questions today at the end as well. So I'm joined by my Xerxes colleague, Jennifer Hopwood, who is a senior conservation entomologist. And today we're talking about soil health, what invertebrates can tell us about soil health. I'll start us off with some background and introductory information about soil life. Then Jennifer will share her expertise on soil invertebrate groups and what monitoring can tell us. And then I'll wrap up with how to monitor and improve soil invertebrate habitat and share those resources for learning more. All right, let's go on to introduce you to the Xerxes Society. If you aren't familiar with us, we're a nonprofit conservation organization working to protect invertebrates and their habitats for over 50 years now. And we approach conservation through education and outreach. We do a lot of habitat restoration, community science, and research. And we do this work across a variety of landscapes, from agriculture, urban, to natural lands as well. And we have remote staff in 25 states now. We are growing a lot. I'm based in New Mexico, and Jennifer is based in Nebraska. So we're an organization that focuses primarily on invertebrates. So let's talk about why invertebrates are so critical for thinking about conservation. And just a reminder, invertebrates are groups of animals that don't have a backbone or bony skeleton. Some are entirely soft-bodied, some have exoskeletons or shells like mollusks or snails and mussels of that hard outer covering. And invertebrates are an extremely diverse group. If you look at the numbers here, invertebrates at the very bottom, 1.49 million described species, and 90% of all insects on the planet, or of all animals on the planet, are insects, almost more than half of all living species, and they can be found just about everywhere, from mountain ranges to super hot deserts. And we don't know exactly how many there are on Earth, but it's estimated there could be as many as 10 million invertebrate species. There are approximately 1.4 billion insects for every person on Earth, so they are extremely abundant. And the weight of all insects is about 70 times more than all the people on Earth. So lots and lots of insects and other invertebrates that we focus on protecting. And one thing to note is that of all those million plus species of insects, only about 2% are considered pests that can cause economic damage to human interest or activity. So the rest of these millions of insect species are really important to us and to support our ecosystems. So looking at the role insects and invertebrates play, all that incredible diversity and abundance I mentioned is really reflected in their critical importance for the functioning of our ecosystems. That includes things like soil health, moving nutrients and decomposing organic matter. They also really help control pest populations. So we have lots of predators and parasitoids that help control other insects. Insects are a huge base of the food chain by feeding other wildlife species. Other insects are eating each other, and then they're also pollinating plants, which produce fruits and seeds for lots of other wildlife that depend on that food source. So Xerces, our kind of motto is protecting the life that sustains us. And this is because invertebrates really are critical to the function of most of our ecosystems. So that's an introduction of Xerces. Here's a quick agenda of what we'll be going through today. We'll understand the roles of invertebrates in soil health and who those invertebrates are, how they can be indicators of soil health, and then how you can monitor them, support them, and then other resources to learn more. So this takes us to our focus. Soil is really full of life, from the tiniest microbes of bacteria, fungi, and protists, and increasing in size to mesoinvertebrates, macroinvertebrates, and of course, plants are a huge part of soil life, and then also all the way up to bigger vertebrate animals. And even if we look at just a tiny small sample of soil, like 1 teaspoon of soil, contains more living organisms than there are people in the world. This estimate includes about 1 billion bacteria, several thousand protozoans, nematodes, fungal filaments, and lots of other tiny critters. So there is just an incredible supportive life that is found in the soil. And if we look at the kind of relative abundance of what that soil life looks like for like every one vertebrate that is using the soil, there's about 100 slugs and snails, 3,000 potworms, earthworms. I'll let you continue to look through that, but at the foundation of this are bacteria, actinomycetes, and fungi. There can be trillions of these for every one vertebrate. And this figure is based on 10 square feet of soil. So the microbes do get a lot of attention because they do form that big abundance. But all of these critters in this abundance of soil life pyramid are really critical to the function of our soils and our terrestrial ecosystems. And that soil life is really diverse. We have big vertebrates that are really impacting soils, like our prairie dogs. And then we have really complex things like biological soil crust that contain a multitude of different organisms holding the soil together. So there's this incredible diversity of living things that use soil, and soil is really magnificent, not only in that it provides habitat for those plants, microbes, and animals I'm talking about, but also it's really important for our water cycle, the water supply and regulation, the filtration of where most of our fresh water is in the world is in soil or underneath soil. It's also a really important element of recycling and storage of organic matter, carbon. I'm sure we're all quite familiar with the importance of storing carbon here on Earth, and its foundation of life to provide a substrate for plants to grow as well. And then, of course, construction, we're living on top of soil. Gravity keeps us here on top of soil. So it's really important in terms of just stabilizing our life. And soil is not just dirt. There's different elements of soil to consider of how it is suitable habitat for this incredible amount of life we're talking about. So soil is this layering of mineral particles with all the life that we talked about, and then organic material of dead plants and animals. There are structures, horizons, soil aggregates. It's in its place where it's supposed to be on the Earth's crust. When we move that soil, it becomes soil material. It's disturbed, removed. It's not creating that essential habitat that is a healthy soil. But obviously, it's still a useful material for us to use in our gardens and hopefully get back to that maintained soil profile again. And then, of course, there's dirt and debris that is not soil. That's on the other spectrum of what soil habitat is. And I mentioned that bacteria are the most abundant soil life, and I want to kind of highlight those really quick before I let Jennifer jump into the bigger invertebrates. But bacteria is the most abundant soil organism concerning biomass. And then we also have fungi is also very, very abundant, and its ability to help move energy through the energy webs of soil is really important. And I want to illustrate that here with showing the flow of energy, where green arrows show the direction and relationship of energy flow of that carbon between groups of organisms. And this does not show the living plants and their roots or larger animals, but it zeroes in on these organic residues, the bottom green triangle here of dead plant material, dead animals too. And if we look at bacteria, that's circled in orange here, we can see the movement or transfer of energy and decomposition, but they're really short networks. They're really just breaking down that dead carbon material, and it stays there. Whereas if we look at fungi, they make that material available to a lot more organisms. So it's really important to understand to have this really complex web of life. Microbes are critical, and fungi are even more critical to making that material available to lots of other species. And one group I want to highlight that is a combination of these things that is unique to New Mexico and lots of other arid regions of the world is our biological soil crust. And here's a really long academic definition of them, but specifically I want to highlight biocrust are a symbiosis between cyanobacteria, algae, lichens, bryophytes, moss, and the bacteria, fungi, and archaea that combine and use these. And there's unique species of different combinations of all these organisms. It's a really interesting world of soil life that I'll share some resources at the end if you want to learn more about them, but definitely kind of a unique soil life to consider for our really sensitive desert soils here in New Mexico. So that's my part, but before Jennifer dives into the bigger invertebrate groups and their roles in soil health, I do want to share a little bit about why that is so important, the insects and invertebrates she's talking about. That there's a lot of alarming headlines out there that invertebrates are in decline across the globe. And this number can be observed in pollinators, in aquatic invertebrates. It can be seen in many different ways. but we also don't have a lot of research to show how in decline soil invertebrates are. But there's a couple examples, like this study in German nature reserves between 1986 and 2016. The insect biomass has declined by 76%. And this is in a place that is in nature preserves that aren't really impacted by, lots of changing land use. So it's really alarming to see these declines, but we're going to talk about how we can address them and what practices we can implement. So just to give you a little background of why these invertebrates are important, and I'll let Jenny jump in now and advance slides for her.
You're muted, Jenny.
You're still muted, Jenny.
Oh, sorry. Thanks for thanks for cluing me in. I thought I'd ticked that box, but I hadn't. I'm really excited today to give you a bit of a tour about soil invertebrates. This is a group that have been really understudied and are still to this day not as known as much as we might like or need. And in part that is because they're hard to see and they're underfoot. And anyway, if you wouldn't mind advancing, Caitlin, but we're hoping to keep advancing this field and keep encouraging more research, keep encouraging practitioners to think about these organisms and so forth. So we're going to take a brief tour into some key soil invertebrate groups. Next slide. And as you already heard from Caitlin, soil contains this vast diversity of life. Just to focus it in on soil animals alone, that's 25% of all the species on the planet. So it really does contain this magnificence of life. And again, it's happening all in places where we're not really turning our attention very often. But this web of life that's happening under our foot is really intricate with small and big creatures. And next slide, I'm going to walk you through some of the roles that these animals play, starting with the decomposers. These are soil animals that break down plant and animal matter into bits that are more readily used by bacteria and fungi. And of course, microbes play a really incredibly important role in decomposition. But by breaking down leaves or other detritus or animal matter, it speeds up the decomposition process significantly for these microbes to do their job. And on the next slide, another important role is enriching the soil by integrating nutrients. And as these soil animals move through the soil, either by burrowing or tunneling, they're mixing nutrients and minerals between different soil layers that influences the soil structure and the fertility, and it also helps plant productivity above ground. On next slide. Soil animals are also engineers, and as they tunnel and as they burrow, they are moving soil between layers, of course, and those tunnels help create channels for air to move and water to move, of course, as you know, and can aerate and hydrate the soil, which can be really important. From a plant's perspective, it's also ideal because then they have an easier place to put their roots, and roots always prefer to grow in paths of least resistance. Next slide. And as they're tunneling and burrowing, soil animals are also mixing microbes through these layers, and that's important for all the work that those microbes are doing within the soil. And next slide. And in addition to all this soil engineering work that these animals are doing, they also play multiple roles in food webs. So they might be herbivores, eating plant material, or they might be eating microbes, or they might be predators or parasitoids of other insects or other arthropods. And then some also have a role, similar roles above ground. They might be not only predators or parasitoids of animals in the soil, but they might be doing similar pest control work above ground. And some are also pollinators, moving pollen between flowering plants and allowing them to produce seeds and fruits and reproduce. So there's a lot of complex processes happening out there. And on the next slide, this is just a small slice of the microscopic life that lives within water films. And these groups like rotifers and tardigrades and nematodes and protozoa, they influence microbial structures, and they eat on different groups, and they impact some of these processes we've discussed, but we are not diving into them today. We're going to instead focus on larger soil animals, soil invertebrates. And on the next slide, we're going to start with mites. These are 8-legged relatives of scorpions and spiders, and they can be very, very small, but you can see them with your naked eye. And they're one of the most diverse groups of invertebrates in the soil. And they are also one of the most abundant. So they're in really high numbers. And one of the most important roles that they play is as decomposers. They're really essential for breaking down organic material into smaller bits that can be used by bacteria. There are also some mites that are predatory on life that's smaller than them. So on nematodes or insect eggs, or things like rotifers, those little tiny critters that are living in the water pores. Mites can be really closely tied to the vegetative community above ground. So their communities can be very different from one habitat to another. And because they're so small, they don't have a lot of mobility. Some live in the deep soil layers, some live on the soil surface. But to move around more, sometimes they do hitch a ride on insects. So on the picture here, this is a darkling beetle, and it has clusters of mites hanging on to its legs. And mites can move between dung pats, for example, by clinging onto dung beetles. And that's just an interesting way that they can gain more ground by taking advantage of things that can fly. Our next group are the springtails. These are also quite small, but visible with the naked eye, and they get their common name springtails, also known as columbella, because they do essentially spring through the air. They have a body part on their back end, the spiracula, that's kept under tension. And when they need to move fast, they use it to propel themselves through the air, tumbling, 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 tumbling. And they can be oblong, or they can be very globular. And these springtails consume microbes or graze on other small arthropods. They can really influence the structure of microbial communities through their predation of fungi or bacteria. And they play a role in decomposition as well. Now, our next group is much more visible. So we're taking a pretty big leap in size at this point, going from the very small springtails to the much larger invisible wood lice. You might also know these as roly-polies, or sow bugs or pill bugs. This is a group of crustaceans. So they are they're related to crawdads, to crabs, to other things like that. And most crustaceans are aquatic, but this is a terrestrial group. They still rely on moist places though, because they do lose water through the cuticle, and they breathe through gills. So moisture is a really key component for them. And even where I am in Nebraska, they have, where we get quite a lot more rainfall than you do in New Mexico, their habitat is really restricted to moist soils and times of the year when it's not hot. So These are by and large, woodlice are decomposers and will break down fresh plant debris and sometimes detritus as well. Some particular species actually even have preferences about the leaves from certain species of trees that they like to eat. So some are quite particular eaters. And an interesting thing about woodlice is that we do have quite a lot of introduced species in the United States, at least 1/3. And those were just introduced by accident when we brought in plants from other countries. They happened to be in the soil and then spread throughout. And I'll talk a little bit more about this in a minute, but they do accumulate heavy metals within their bodies, which is unique to the groups that we're talking about today. Our next group are also decomposers, really important decomposers. These are the millipedes. And millipedes get their name, means 1,000 feet. They do have really elongated bodies, and they do have 2 pairs of legs per body segment. Very few species actually have 1,000 feet, but there are at least 1 or 2 species out there that do. Most have several hundred. And they have really effective chewing mouth parts. So this is not a group that bites people, but they do chow down on plant material. And just to throw a number out there, they're responsible for breaking down 10 to 15% of leaf fall, for example, to help with decomposition. And they're really powerful diggers. They excavate really deep soil, so they are moving a lot of those nutrients as they dig. This is a group that's long-lived. Most insects and most arthropods are more on the short end of life cycles, just a couple weeks, some a month or so, some a year. Millipedes can be long-lived up to 11 years and invest quite a lot of care into rearing their young. Our next group are the earthworms. And this is also a very familiar group. They have this really unique tubular body plan with a mouth on one end and their anus on the other. And they munch through leaf layers and soil itself. And when it comes out the other end, it's filled with a lot of nutrients, 50% more than the surrounding soil, for example. So not only do they add nutrients to the soil when they are moving through the soil, they can improve the soil structure through aeration and allowing for better water infiltration and so forth. So earthworms often can be really beneficial to soil health. However, it can also be context dependent based on what species are in what type of habitat. In New Mexico and in the Southwest in general, there's not as many earthworms, and in part because earthworms do need a lot of moisture. They exchange gas through their cuticle, so they have sort of this slimy layer that helps facilitate that, but they are also most often found in moist areas. And on the next slide, just to talk about this group of introduced species really briefly, this is not a group that's currently found in New Mexico, but I wanted to highlight it today because it is found in states that border New Mexico to the east. So it's present in Texas and Oklahoma, and even on the northeast corner in Kansas, and up where I am in Nebraska as well. And pretty much the eastern United States, and a few states in the West. So they're closing in. This is a group of introduced species known as the jumping worms, and they get their name because they do thrash around wildly. Like if you've ever picked up a snake before and it just thrashes around, that's how these earthworms behave similarly. And what makes these earthworms different than a lot of other introduced species of earthworms and from native earthworms too is that they do consume that leaf layer that's full of a lot of rich nutrients. And rather than mixing those nutrients into the soil layers, they pretty much just leave it on the surface. So it never gets integrated. And that means that those soils lose out on those nutrients. They have higher levels of erosion as well because they don't have as much protection from that leaf layer. And all the plants and animals that rely on that leaf layer miss out too on the habitat that's lost. So this is a real problem, particularly in forests that have a really important leaf layer that's critical for birds and reptiles and insects in like the Northern Great Lakes and in the Northeast and so forth. Anyway, to get to the point though, for New Mexico, it's good to be really careful about preventing the spread of this species. So be really careful about bringing in plants from nearby states that have jumping worms. Don't share compost. Or if you're using compost, make sure it's been treated at a facility that gets to high temperatures, because jumping worm eggs are very resistant to high temperatures and low temperatures. So, but commercial composting facilities can break down their eggs. And don't release worms if you've used them for bait or for vermicomposting. Currently, there are no ways to control jumping worms, so prevention is really important to keep these from moving into your state. Our next group, just to completely move in a different direction now, we're going to talk about some predators for a few slides. And we're going to talk about spiders, which are arthropods. And spiders have 8 legs. They have 2 body regions. They have multiple eyes, usually between 6 and 8. And they rely on that eyesight, especially these key groups, to help them hunt other arthropods, and especially insects. They're predatory from nymphs to adults. And these 3 groups of spiders that you see on the screen are hunting spiders that chase down their prey in the leaf litter or in the soil. There are other spider groups that are influential to soil as well, that spin webs like the one you see on the far right, directly on the soil surface, and also some groups that actually build tunnels or tubes to trap and ambush their prey. But I just wanted to focus on the hunting spiders really briefly today because they are more visible and easier to use in monitoring practices. Spiders can play a lot of important roles through moving soil and working the soil, but really their primary role is as predators, and they can contribute to crop pests above ground and in the upper layers of the soil as well. And they're long-lived. They can live for 1 to 3 years. Okay, next slide. Our next group of predators are ground beetles, and these are really not very colorful beetles, but can be pretty visible and quite large, sometimes maybe ½ an inch, but up to 1 inch or 1.5 inches even. And these are predatory both as larvae, which is in the middle picture you see here, and as adults on either side. And they tackle prey that can be quite large, including slugs and snails, but also grasshoppers and crickets and caterpillars. So they're very important in pest control. And then they also contribute in other ways by eating weed seeds, contributing to decomposition as well. So this is just a very valuable group in particular. This is another long-lived group. They just have 1 generation of growing season, so it can take some time for their populations to build up. And they, like a lot of longer-lived critters, do invest a lot of care in their young. Okay, on our next slide are the wonderful and amazing dung beetles, which are have these oval bodies and these scalloped legs, which help them with digging. Dung beetles are excellent flyers, and they're really good at finding dung in all sorts of places. So they can detect dung through its scent and find it and lay their eggs or secure the dung really quickly. And they have a couple different strategies based on the species of beetle. They might lay their eggs directly in the dung pat. They might dig a tunnel underneath and then pull pieces of the dung down into the tunnel. Or, as you can see in the middle picture, they roll the dung away in a ball into their nest, where they store it and lay their eggs on it. And keep it. And all these strategies are important and different, but it might be funny to say this, but dung is like a very important resource. So they use all these strategies to secure it and keep it from other species. And there are a number of other species that like to use dung, in particular parasites, fly parasites of livestock like screwworm and hornworm. So dung beetles breaking down this dung as fast as possible can reduce the habitat for those parasites. And their general breakdown and consumption of this dung is also really important in reducing the spread of food pathogens on farms. And in rangeland areas or on livestock grazing areas, it's also really critical for the improvement of forage. And so all of this has been estimated to be worth about $400 million per year, just the work of these dung beetles. So it's pretty incredible. All right, our next slide, we're going to talk about ants. And ants play multiple roles in the food web. They eat small arthropods, they eat dead things, they move seeds around, but probably their most notable role is as ecosystem engineers. And that's because ants engineer these huge extensive nests underground. And in that process, they excavate and mix soil. One estimate puts it like 30 tons per acre per year, which is just an astonishing amount of soil to move. And so they're working the soil, they're aerating it, they're hydrating it, they're integrating nutrients, and they're contributing to decomposition. So they're doing all this really important work. In the picture off to the right, you can see this is an ant biologist, Walter Chinkel, and he made casts, plaster casts of ant colonies. So that's what these colonies look like. They can be really extend deep into the earth, 12 feet or more, and they can have tens of thousands of workers. And unusually, ants live in these social colonies, which is most insects don't build these social colonies, but ants live these social lives in which they have one individual, the queen, that reproduces, and then lots of workers within the colony that have designated roles. And most of those workers are female. So if you see ants lifting heavy things and doing lots of work, it's the female workers that are putting in all that time. And one more thing to say about ants is we have a lot of high species diversity of ants in the United States. We also have a number of introduced species that were introduced accidentally through bringing in plants and soil. And some of those are pests. For example, Argentinian ants and red imported fire ants are two examples of some pests that are pests in urban areas as well as agricultural areas. All right, our next group are related to ants. These are bees and wasps, and specifically those bees and wasps that nest in the ground. About 75–80% of all species of bees in North America nest in the ground, and their nest might be just a couple centimeters deep or a foot or more. And the female bees that dig those nests and create those nests provision those nests with pollen and nectar for their young. So they visit a lot of flowers and collect pollen and nectar, and in the process spread pollen between flowers. So bees in particular are very efficient, very important pollinators of wild plants as well as crops. And that's in addition to all the work they do underground to move soil around. And then their close relatives, the wasps, have a somewhat similar lifestyle where they build nests underground, but the adult females are found on flowers drinking nectar to keep their energy up. Rather than feeding their young pollen, though, they hunt down prey, and so they'll hunt down crickets, grasshoppers, stink bugs for their young to eat, or Japanese beetle larvae. They'll dig down and lay their eggs on Japanese beetles, and then their larvae will slowly, agonizingly eat through their still alive prey. And most of these bees and wasps that live underground are solitary, so they don't have a large colony like ants. They don't tend to defend their nest. because in doing so, they might lose their life and then they couldn't reproduce. So they're quite docile. They don't, they're not aggressive at all, like the solitary species. I'm sorry, the social species. Okay, on our next slide, just to wrap up our profiles of all these amazing groups, it can be really surprising to realize how many different insects have some sort of connection to the soil and have a life stage that depends on the soil. So for one quick example, fireflies, also known as lightning bugs. And you're probably most familiar with these beetles because they have this bioluminescent display as part of their courtship ritual. And their connection to the soils that their larvae seen in this picture off on the right here are predatory. They hunt down slugs and earthworms even, and snails by tracking their slime trails, and are really good hunters on the soil, the upper soil layer and in the leaf layer too. And in New Mexico, this is a group that's really only found in moist places, so floodplains or wetlands or wet meadows, where you can find red-winged blackbirds, those types of places. And if you want to find out more, you can go to fireflyatlas.org. They have a map where there have been sightings in New Mexico. Okay, so in summary, all these animals are making a really big difference for us all the time. They're moving nutrients, they're affecting soil, that influences plant productivity. As Caitlin mentioned, that's supporting carbon storage, which regulates our climate. They're doing other work above ground, like pollinating or providing pest control, or they're food for wildlife. These are really important animals. And in the next slide, and in the slide after that, we're going to talk about how we can use these animals in monitoring to learn more about our environment. And these animals soil invertebrates can be really sensitive to some of our activities. So we can use them to learn more about the impacts of our behaviors. They can be really sensitive to soil disturbances, to heavy metals, to contamination, to chemical disturbances, in agricultural settings or home settings, if we use fertilizers or water, that can change their communities a little bit. They are sensitive to plants above ground and to how we manage those plants above ground too. And next slide, just a couple quick examples of how practices can influence these different groups. Starting with soil disturbance, physical disturbance that breaks up the soil structure can harm soil life. It just removes their habitat. So less disturbed soils have more extensive soil life communities. Similarly, chemical disturbances, whether it's insecticides, herbicides, or fungicides, can disrupt communities and also the microbial communities they interact with. So some can kill outright, and others have other changes, like changes to reproduction or growth. And some of those impacts can be short-lived or long-lived. It just depends on the active ingredient and how it's applied and how often. Other practices like heavy metal contamination can reduce the numbers of individuals and species also. And then, as I mentioned, the life above ground, the plants that are above ground, really have a pretty big influence about what occurs beneath the soil. So with greater plant diversity comes a more rich soil life. And on our next slide, you've probably heard the phrase often about canary in the coal mines, and this idea that coal miners, well, not this idea, this practice that coal miners used to use to bring down canaries down into coal mines, because canaries have very sensitive respiratory systems. So if they brought them down, and if the canary kicked the bucket, it was a way for them to gauge unsafe conditions, and they would come back up if that happened. And in a much less dramatic way, we can use the presence or absence of certain invertebrates or how they change over time to learn more about our environment and disturbances that might be altering our environment. And this is this idea of bioindicators that can help us assess the health or the quality and how it might change over time. Soil invertebrates can be good bioindicators because they're very numerous, especially in soil settings, much more numerous than vertebrates. They're sensitive to disturbances and they respond really quickly to changes. So some examples or groups that you could use to tell you more about the impacts of physical soil disturbances: spiders, ground beetles, mites, earthworms, woodlice, and springtails are all sensitive to soil disturbances. So often their populations, for example, will decrease with tillage, for example. So when you're undertaking soil practices, these can be good groups to use to evaluate those. Chemical soil disturbances can be evaluated by these groups pictured here: ground beetles and springtails on the top picture, as well as spiders and earthworms and woodlice. And they are really quite sensitive to pesticides, so they can respond quickly. Some of these have longer life cycles, so it can take longer for them to bounce back than pests would to pesticide exposure. So like with ground beetles and spiders, I mentioned, for example, that they can live multiple years, but they only have just one generation a year. So they have limited reproductive capacity. Okay, next up are land management indicators. You could use dung beetles to understand more about how dung is being broken down. You could use mites or springtails or ground beetles or spiders to learn more about and millipedes to learn more about restoration and how effective restoration might be, because those are all groups that are associated with plant communities. Spiders are really sensitive to land management, like prescribed burns. So these different groups respond in different ways and might be, really helpful as indicators in those settings. And then lastly, heavy metal contamination. Most invertebrates respond by decreasing in populations. Springtails can be a really useful group to look out for because they're particularly sensitive. So again, they might be that canary in the coal mine. But isopods on the other end of the spectrum would also be, the woodlice are also a good group to look for. They are also sensitive to heavy metals and respond to heavy metals, but in a different way, because they can actually tolerate some level of heavy metals. They sort of sequester the heavy metals away in their pancreas-like organ. So they can have a lot of exposure before their populations respond and blink out. So they're a good group to use to look at different levels of heavy metal contamination. And Caitlin, if you can just click one more. And we do have a bioindicator guide, which Caitlin will talk a little bit more about, that walks through these different groups and how to recognize them as well. And now I will turn it back to Caitlin.
Thank you, Jennifer. I love seeing all of those critters and your expertise on how they respond to all those different disturbances and how we can use them. So I'll talk pretty quickly about how we can monitor these different soil invertebrates, these bigger ones in particular. So there's a couple different ways to think about how to scout, monitor, and observe invertebrates. So there's ways you can have just more formal or informal sampling, and some of the materials you might need. So there are pitfall traps. I'll describe how to and show pictures of each of these. There's Burlees funnels, Behrman funnels, and some of the materials you might need include some dishes, soapy water if you want to collect and preserve your insects, a microscope, needles, tweezers, hand lens, and then references for identifying those things. So, and another way you can work on this is just using simple observation as you work in the soil. You can observe under rocks, logs, boards, but I'll talk about these kind of more standardized ways of, here's like an option of just like lifting up something and looking at the soil and seeing who is using that very top layer of surface. And here's some of those other materials you might be using as you observe your catch. So one way you can observe it's a little bit more material required are these Burlese funnels, where you gather the organic material, leaf litter on top of the soil, and allow those invertebrates to fall down through a funnel and collect them at the bottom. And this requires maybe a little bit more time and materials. And in New Mexico, we often don't have a really thick leaf litter or organic layer, so these might not be the best options and require a little bit more expertise in materials. So what I really want to focus on are pitfall traps, which is a trap where you dig into the soil and place a container where the opening is flush with the soil, that you can take out, remove, process your catch, and make sure that soil is filled up right along the edges. So whatever's walking along and comes to this rim, they happen to just fall in. And you'll leave it for a set period of time, usually overnight. Oops. And those bigger invertebrates crawling ones that walk along the soil surface, that's what you'll really be catching the most of. You can leave the container dry or empty, or you can put in soapy water to immobilize and kill that catch. So then you can have the actual sample for a while. You can set a cover over it so you don't have lots of things falling into it, leaf litter or other plants, or maybe something might come along and eat the insects that are caught in there. So something to cover it but doesn't sit flush on the soil is a good idea. And on the right is an example of a baited trap to look for dung beetles. So you can put some dung right over the pitfall trap to see if you have dung beetles. And you want to set these up in a way that you can compare invertebrate communities across seasons, vegetation, and different management, and just do it over time to see, to have a kind of inventory of what exists and then monitor for changes as seasons progress or other management is implemented. And we have resources on Xerces that I'll go into a little bit later, but you can use these pitfall traps to look at those soil invertebrates in different systems where you have a higher plant diversity or more bare ground, just to see what those different communities look like, and use the soil scouting guide as a way to help you go through that protocol and observe these differences between other landscapes. So here's just an example of what that looks like. You have different traps that correspond to different habitat types and the microhabitat, and then calculate what critters you're seeing. And what you can use, a couple pocket guides we have developed at Xerces. This should be on our website any day now. Our pocket guide on invertebrates of urban soils. This goes a little bit more into species or insect groups that are more affected by heavy metals and more urban contaminants. We also have our soil invertebrates as bioindicators guide that talks a little bit more in depth about how these groups are bioindicators that Jennifer mentioned. Now, I quickly want to go through how you can get involved with the soil health and soil invertebrates in your property. And so there are a couple ways you can do this. There's a lot of focus on improving soil health through cover crops and working soils, but really we need to think about creating that permanent habitat practices around the working soils you're using. So have designated areas that are no-till, no disturbance, that can be a source population of lots of different invertebrate, soil invertebrates that can move into your working soil land and improve that soil health. Have that area have lots of native plant diversity, from grasses and perennial wildflowers, annuals, shrubs, trees. Just the bigger the diversity, the more diversity of invertebrates you'll be able to support. And leave that plant material, that logs, leaf litter, those are areas that invertebrates nest and overwinter, and that supports lots of other critters, like a lot of different pollinators and other not just soil invertebrates. And then ensure that space is protected from pesticides, because we want this to be a place that really grows your soil invertebrate populations and isn't going to be impacted by either insecticides, herbicides, or fungicides that could impact those communities. And then in our working soil health practices to improve soil invertebrate communities, cover crops is kind of an obvious one, of ensuring that your soil is covered through most seasons, and that that cover crop plays a role of either flowering, supporting lots of other beneficial insects and pollinators, and ideally using that cover crop again to avoid tilling. Maybe you can crimp it or pack it back into the soil and use it as an organic amendment. There's just lots of opportunities with cover crops. So using that not only to cover the soil, but also reduce tillage and be your organic amendment is a really great opportunity. And then, of course, avoiding excessive pesticide use is really going to be beneficial for your soil invertebrate communities. So practicing integrated pest management so that you're prioritizing cultural prevention practices that will hopefully help you reduce pesticide use in the long run and avoid impacting the good insects that you want in your soils and visiting your plants. So a couple opportunities in New Mexico to create this habitat for soil invertebrates and improve soil health for soil invertebrates include the NMDA's Healthy Soil Program. They offer grants every year. I know they just closed in mid-March or so, but start thinking about if you have an opportunity to apply for a grant, look at what has been awarded on the NMDA Healthy Soil Program website. That's a really great opportunity to incorporate a lot of these practices. And then something coming up from Xerces is our New Mexico Pollinator Habitat Kit program. So we have a residential public space program for Santa Fe, but we also have a newer program for working lands, conservation lands throughout northern New Mexico, where we're offering about 100 native pollinator plants. And the proposals for that are open from May through June, and we distribute those plants in late August. So feel free to email me or check out our website for the New Mexico Pollinator Habitat Kits. And I'll jump into resources really quickly since we're almost out of time. Here are some publications you can check out to really dive into soil biodiversity. The last on there is a book, Life in the Soil by Jim Nardi. Very great, accessible read. And of course, USDA and RCS has lots of practices and resources on implementing soil health. NRCS was originally called the Soil Conservation Service, and they help farmers, ranchers, forest landowners conserve soil, water, air, and other natural resources. So you can see their soil health website. And then also there are conservation programs that help people reduce soil erosion, enhance water supplies, improve water quality, and of course, increase wildlife habitat. And you can get technical and financial assistance for agricultural producers to help them plan and implement those conservation practices. And if you want to learn a bit more about your soil and soil throughout New Mexico or the whole US, you can check out the NRCS's web soil survey. Highly recommend that if you want to learn a little bit more about soil types, health, characteristics, and the maps of where those soils exist throughout New Mexico. And then Xerces, we have a whole website on soil life and a handbook that is extremely thorough and beneficial for understanding how to support soil invertebrates and soil health on farms. You can get the PDF for free, or you can purchase a hard copy from SARE.org. We also have scouting guides for soil, for foliage, and for flowers to better understand what invertebrates are using the land on your property. We have so many other guides if you want to go to xerces.org and find out more. I also briefly want to mention there are some really cool guides about soil crust if you want to learn more about them. The Bowker Lab at NAU has these two manuals on how to identify different soil crust and monitor soil crust. And finally, I want to say thank you to any donors that are listening today. Xerces is a donor-supported nonprofit, and we really appreciate all the support we get from them. And if you want to think about joining, please think about it. Thank you so much to our supporters, our members, to the Petrie Foundation for our work in New Mexico, and thank you to the New Mexico Healthy Soils Working Group for having us. And with that, I will take questions. Only 3 minutes past the hour.
Awesome. Thank you both, Caitlin, Jenny. That was terrific. Always so much to learn from you both. And I just love all the care you take. And it's a wonderful resource, of course, the Xerces Society, like you just very quickly showed. All the different publications are beautiful, informative, meticulously researched, and cannot recommend them highly enough. So we do have a couple questions in the chat that we can go over here. We'll start with David, who was asking, given the comparison or contrast of bacteria and fungi, I think in enumeration, should we focus more on increasing soil fungi, and if so, how? Do you have an answer to that?
Jenny, do you think you have a good thought on that?
I sure don't. It's a good question.
That is a good question. I think, you know, I think it's just important that we remember it's not just about a lot of different bacterial microbes, and that the fungi are also really important. I don't know. I'm curious, Jenny, do you have any thoughts on like mycorrhizal additives to soil, inoculating soil? Maybe that's something that is relevant to this question.
It's a good question. I think those inoculations have shown that they do increase establishment in some cases, but it definitely depends on the species that you're planting and the species you're inoculating. And it's early days with regards to inoculations and research and restoration, I think. But just for a quick anecdote, when I was in graduate school, which was quite a while back now, I had a colleague who and this was in Kansas, so it was prairie country, but she actually painstakingly used fungicides to remove the microbial communities just to look at the impacts over time on plants. and it was significant, very significant. So they're out there doing their work, and yeah, I think just doing the basics to support overall soil health is really critical for supporting fungi, as well as all the other important pieces of life in the soil.
Yeah, and I can maybe just add to that. So what you see in a lot of farm soils is a lack of fungi. It's all about a balance, right? I mean, it's evolved together, this very diverse microbiome, and fungi are a very important piece of that. They are able to access minerals and nutrients, make them available to plants that are otherwise unavailable to plants. So that is definitely a very big benefit of them. So you do want your fungi, and they also hold the soil particles together in ways that is not facilitated otherwise. So these are just two examples of the benefits that fungi provide and the very specific services that they provide to the soil health. So yes, you do want to have fungi, and how you can encourage them. In one of the best ways probably is not to disturb the soil. So you have a lot more fungi in a no-till or low-till soil, and also pesticide, herbicide, chemical disturbance-free soils. So that's just an idea. And in terms of if you compost, a static compost tends to encourage more fungi in it, again, because you're not turning it, you're not actually disrupting the fungi from growing. So those are just some ideas, and it's a really good question. Let's go to the next one. Has there been any research, this is from Lark, has there been any research on the impact of microplastics on these invertebrate groups? The PFAS, very important right now.
Yeah, I think that's also in early days, but the short story is that definitely microplastics can, like when an earthworm ingests them or when nematodes ingest them, they can have impacts on reproduction and life longevity. So yes, and probably in other ways and on other groups too. I don't think there's been like a very good community analysis yet, but on groups that are much easier to test, yes, there are definite impacts.
Should I go to the next one from Amy?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, in thinking about fire-adapted climate, are there insects which also have evolved with and or depend on fire?
Yeah, I mean, I know you probably have some examples of Great Plains insects. But yes, I would say, you know, I'm not super knowledgeable about New Mexico specific insects that depend on our frequent fire regimes of more ponderosa pine forests, but there's definitely a you know, longer term benefit when fire comes through an ecosystem. It has a disturbance effect, but will open up a lot more soil and water and sunlight to a lot of perennial forbs that will boost plant diversity and then have a more beneficial impact to creating habitat for lots of other invertebrates, not just soil invertebrates, but other pollinators. So it's kind of a delayed effect, I think. But maybe, Jennifer, you have an example of something that really depends on fire more directly.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think so. This is really Great Plains specific though, but we have a really big issue with eastern red cedar as a juniper species that invades, and it's especially invading from the east, and that degrades grasslands really quickly, and it changes the species that can live in that grassland. It moves grassland birds, it pushes them out too because they no longer have the open habitat they need to reproduce and to stay away from predators. So it has a lot of impacts on the ecosystem. And without fire, which used to routinely suppress those species, the eastern red cedar anyway, and a couple other woody species, there's just a fewer and fewer insects that can use that habitat as it gets invaded. So things like the regal fritillary butterfly, which might have a couple subpopulations in New Mexico out in the eastern portion. That's a good example of one species that really relies on open habitat and can make it through burns. Even somehow we don't really quite understand how. Maybe they're nestling down deep in the grass thatch and a burn can go right over without harming them, or some might die, but they recolonize. So in general, fire as a disturbance can be really beneficial to some ecosystems and a lot of the insects that live within them. One interesting thing about fires is, of course, the fuel load influences the temperatures, but in general, here in Nebraska, a researcher put some temperature probes certain distances under the soil to see how the temperature fluctuated with burns at different times of the year. Because sometimes people like to do spring burns versus fall versus mid-season, and spring burns are often really quite hot. But even then, the heat didn't penetrate much more, very deep. So the impacts to some of these groups might be less than what we've sort of always assumed. That's all I have, I think.
Thank you. The next question is a funny one. So Regan is asking, how many prairie dogs is too many prairie dogs?
Well, I'm not extremely familiar with prairie dog populations in New Mexico. Like they're definitely been removed in a lot of situations. And so that recolonization, I mean, you know, they make big colonies. They can have a big impact on a small acreage. So it's definitely understandable that prairie dogs can have a big impact and are probably not conveniently located in a lot of situations. How many is too many? That's something I'm not entirely sure of, and just understanding their predator dynamics, allowing coyotes and badgers and other predators to help manage their populations is critical. But yeah, I don't know, Jennifer, do you have any thoughts on prairie dogs?
Don't. I think that's a good answer. It probably is also really context dependent, like you said. And whoever's making that call on how many is too many.
Answer is always, it depends.
It depends. That's always a great answer.
Okay, now Teresa had a really interesting comment. She had to jump off, but she's saying, very nice presentation. Thank you. I have to leave, but just want to share a local result from a 2024 Santa Fe Mountain. I don't know if you're familiar with that one. In troll forest sites. Very high levels, 350 to 400 number per grams of beneficial bacteria feeding nematodes were found in 3 of the 4 controlled sites, and none were detected in the 4 treated, thinned and burnt sites. An expanded soil fungi study in Santa Fe Mountains will be starting this summer through UNM Biology. I don't know if you're familiar with this. I was not. Any comments on that?
Yeah, I've heard Teresa talk a little bit about that. Thanks for coming, Teresa. And I'm not super familiar with this study, but I will mention that in these disturbance adapted systems, there is a cycle of depletion, but then regrowth. I'm not sure enough about the dynamics of nematodes and forested soil systems, but that's what I'm assuming is the situation here, is that that disturbance of thinning has removed some element of the habitat, or in the control sites, not all of them had those nematodes, but it created conditions that were better habitat for them. But yeah, it's definitely lots of questions, and excited to see there's more research going into that.
Oh, here's maybe one more. Okay, here's one more question. Johanna, is there a pocket guide to invertebrates in arid and semi-arid areas specifically?
Not by Xerces. Maybe that's something we should talk about, Jennifer.
It would be really fun. Yeah. I didn't talk about scorpions.
Yeah, there's definitely other cool arid invertebrates to talk about. And I mean, even just soil crust, I had to give soil crust some attention, because yeah, that's a whole different suite of soil life that is not applicable to most of the US. But yeah, we don't have one, but if anyone knows of like do you know of a resource, Isabel, that's maybe similar to that?
No, I don't, but I would love to do our next partnership webinar on soil crusts. I actually put a note myself. I think that we should do that. That is so fascinating and so specific and so fragile and endangered. And that was maybe my question for you guys is, so we are very used to, unfortunately, getting a lot of very bad news about insects in general, invertebrates in general, on how they are at a sort of staggering decline. You mentioned the German study that was a few years old, but there was actually quite recently another one from the US citing also, butterflies, insects in general. How endangered is our soil life? Do you have a sense of that?
I think that's for you, Jenny.
Yeah, no, we don't really know very much at all. As much as we need lots more monitoring in general for terrestrial insects, I think soil insects are sort of uniquely less studied. I guess to throw out one group that we do have a little bit of numbers on is tiger beetles. And we didn't talk about tiger beetles today, but they are predators as larvae and as adults. But as larvae, they make these tunnels, and then they hang out and they pop up and drag things in really dramatically. And then the adults are actually really fast runners and flyers. And those kind of follow similar trends to some of these other groups of recent declines. So that's the one group that comes to mind that I know that we have data for, but I think we could, it'd be really nice to think about sort of a long-term monitoring for groups like dung beetles and ground beetles, or some sort of network to look into that a little bit further. It would be just really helpful.
Great. Well, thank you both. I think that wraps it up. Thank you, everybody, for joining. Thanks for your great questions. We have recorded this, and we will post it on our YouTube channel, where you can find a ton of other webinars and videos as well. There's some thank yous in the chat for the both of you, and yeah, really very informative, and always a pleasure to work with you. So thanks a lot, and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Awesome. Thanks, Isabel. Thanks, Jenny. Thanks, everyone.
Caitlin.
Bye.